everyone. Welcome back to another session here at the Holy Tisch Convention with a wonderful session and almost closing keynote by Rick Stepp. Welcome, Rick. Really happy that you're here. In his speech today, Rick will address what food can teach us about cultural myths and identity. Rick is involved with his work in long-term fieldwork with indigenous communities in Mesoamerica and Southeast Asia. He's a professor of anthropology at the University of Florida. We know each other from my time at the Slow Food University in Italy, where he teaches. He's also involved in Slow Food USA. And with everything he does, he's critically looking at how the relationship between biological diversity and cultural diversity is interconnected. And I think one more thing that I remember about you is that you're a big tea lover, as I remember our classes, which is might or might not play a role in your work as well. We'll see later, I guess. But enough from me at this point. I will hand over to you, and I'm very excited to hear about your perspective on cultural myths and identity. And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of the organizers. This has been an incredibly exciting and well-organized conference, and I'm glad we've been able to bring together so many amazing people. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the week. What I'd like to talk about today is what can food teach us about cultural myths and identity. And I'm going to talk in some fairly general context, but I also have a few case studies that I want to use to illuminate this topic. Next slide, please. Begin with this famous painting by Paul Gauguin. It's actually missing a U there, my apologies for that, that he did based on his time in Tahiti. And this was painted in 1897, and the English translation for it is, "Where do we come from, what are we, and where are we going?" And he wanted to represent really the three fundamental questions about the nature of life that he'd learned as a young man. And obviously his time at Tahiti changed his outlook in terms of spirituality and his outlook towards the environment. And there's been a lot of work done on this painting, critical work, and it's generally explained as being read right to left with the three stages of aging. But one point that doesn't get brought up very often, that was the first thing that struck me, and I guess you find oftentimes what you're looking for, but that food is at front and center of this painting. So in this exploration of who we are as people and what is the nature of humankind, food plays a central role. I did a little bit of research to find out what these species were, and I have to admit I haven't been very successful. There is a letter that Gauguin wrote to his friend explaining the painting, and he just mentions that the woman is picking fruit. So we'll have to wait to see if we can figure out what species it is. In any case, we'll return to Polynesia shortly. If I could have the next slide, please. The question is, where does myth come from? And it's pretty clear that both our own kind, in terms of Homo sapiens sapiens, and our closely related Neanderthal ancestors, were deeply concerned with myth. Well, how do we know this? Obviously, they didn't write anything down. We don't have any direct evidence of that. But if we look at what they left behind in terms of these cave paintings, they start to suggest a pretty interesting relationship with the supernatural world and with myth. And this is really where myth starts. And as time has gone on, more and more of these cave paintings have been discovered. The original ones were found in Europe, but now in many places across the world, these are showing up. And we know a couple things. One, we also find the beginnings of planned burials around the same time as these cave paintings, which suggests at least some sort of conceptualization of the supernatural and the afterlife. But with regards to food, what we see is that animals and hunting are quite common in a lot of these paintings. Now, sometimes well-known animal species are represented, and been able to figure out that these were in fact the animals that were being hunted. Sometimes there's species that are likely fantastical, but the role is pretty clear that there's some sort of engagement with food and myth here. And again, food and food production is at front and center of these. And this image here, you can see very clearly the hunt taking place from the caves in Vallarta, Spain. Next slide. Well, the field of comparative mythology has a lot to tell us about food myths and stories. Now, these broad generalist types of approaches have become less common these days in favor of more nuanced, particular approaches whereby scholars pay pretty close attention to the details of an individual society and not as much in terms of looking for relationships between myths, between different societies. But the scholars that have taken this generalist approach, most notably Campbell, demonstrate how a culture's mode of subsistence, which is how they procure food, ends up shaping their myths and cosmos. And we see this with forager, hunter-gatherer groups. I'm going to use the term interchangeably here. They tend to favor what we call animistic over theistic types of religions and spiritual approaches, where the supernatural world is present throughout the natural world and it takes forms in both animate and inanimate objects. So really everything is imbued with these sort of spiritual elements. And that tends to shift a bit when we move to agriculture, but I should point out that even some agricultural societies maintain significant aspects of animism. There's a story from when I was working in Highland Chiapas, Mexico with the Tzeltal Maya. There's an elderly man who had a fruit grove and a lot of fruit trees. And every morning he would get up and take an axe and walk around the trees and shake his axe at the trees. And his explanation for it was that he was trying to scare the trees into making fruit for him. And so it's that idea that trees they have significance more than just being alive. They actually have this supernatural component to them. Going back to foraging and hunter-gatherer societies, though, they find really close kinship with the animal and plant worlds. It's not uncommon to have kinship terms and all sorts of familial relationships noted through the plants and animals. But what we see is the rise of horticulture and agriculture requires people to obviously closer attention to seasons and to the land itself. And it brings an emphasis on fertility. We see mother goddesses of the earth appear. We see harvest gods appear. And really significantly, the cycle of death and rebirth shows up in these myths, at least in regions where, besides the tropics, where you see a significant die-off of vegetation in the winter. As agriculture continues to get larger and larger in some societies, and with it the rise of the state, you start to see a shift towards monotheism, where one god emerges, a powerful and possibly vengeful god, and usually tied to the staple crop, the monoculture agriculture. And this has a functional purpose if you think about the need to coerce people and consolidate large labor forces to engage in monoculture agriculture versus more diversified horticulture. And with it comes these gods that in many instances are pretty scary, and you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of them. So of course you do the quite backbreaking and long days in order to produce the crop for society. Next slide, please. And we also see agricultural societies begin to really closely identify their own origins, their own biological origins with their major crops. And this is true all over the world. I'm going to just give a couple examples here, but of really well-known examples, the Mayans come from maize or corn. And we know this in terms of oral histories, but also it was written down in the Popol Vuh, which was a sacred narrative of the Quiche Maya in Guatemala. It was written down around the mid-1500s, and obviously at this point Spaniards, the conquest had begun, but the written form of this carries forward to this day. And so we can look at these really wonderful stories and see what they tell us about the people and their food and where they come from. And the Popol Vuh itself starts off with, and this is a rough English translation, but it says, "We shall plant," ancient word. It's planting, its roots beginning, Ushena al Puch. This is from Victor Monteo's translation. But the idea is that even in the words themselves, they generate from the agriculture. And so that's pretty phenomenal. But if you get into the story, and I unfortunately don't have the time to tell it fully and all its splendor, but there were two creator gods, the god and the goddess. The gender sometimes varies based on the translation and people's telling of it. But they wanted to talk about the creation of how the world the present world. And the gods ask, well, what materials can we use? And the goddess says, well, our friends here, the jaguar, the coyote, the parrot, the crow, they already know, and we'll use corn. And so this land where lots of white and yellow corn is growing, and they call it pashil, so it means a mountain split open, has a lot of fruits and seeds as well growing in it, beans, cacao, etc. And well, we need to get going before dawn, the gods say, so they go ahead and make the flesh out of white corn for the men and the yellow corn for the female. And they make the arms and legs out of cornmeal, and they ground up enough corn to make gruel to fill 9 gourds. And from these gourds is where the muscle strength and power comes from. And it goes on and on, but it's always referencing back to this really significant agricultural product of corn that was originally domesticated in Mesoamerica by Mayans and their ancestors. Of course, corn took thousands of years to fully domesticate from its original precursor crop, teosinte. But along the way, people identify so strongly, and they are the people of corn. Next slide. And going back to Polynesia, they also have a wonderful story of their origins, in this case from the staple crop known as kalo or taro. The pronunciation and spelling changes a bit across different Polynesian islands. But the story of Haloa in Hawaii, and this is also quite a wonderful and detailed story, but this is how Hawaiians were created, and it has this, again, starts with 2 gods, the Wakea and Papa, so the Father Sky and Mother Earth, created the islands that we know as Hawaii. They have a daughter, and the daughter's name is the making of the stars in heaven, and they also conceive another child, and the family waits for the birth, and it ends up that the baby's stillborn. This is obviously a huge loss, and they're quite upset about it, and they decide to bury the child in the Aina, which translates into English as land, but it really doesn't do the term justice, because it in the Hawaiian language, it really means that which feeds. And based on the advice of the elders at Kapuna, they who say that, well, this child looks like a root, they place the child to the ground, and there's crying over the grave, so this creates water, and as all of a sudden this plant starts to emerge, and from this plant we see the taro. And so to this day, taro is both an incredibly important food crop in Polynesia, but also has a lot of spiritual significance. And again, it's tying this origin back to the food. In fact, the word for family itself, ohana, in Hawaiian comes from this plant as well. Next slide, please. And it's not just the taro that we're talking about here. The Polynesians, as they moved across the various islands over an enormously large area, the extent of Polynesia is one of the largest extents of any culture group in the world, if not the largest. And when they went to these islands that at the time were uninhabited, they carried around 27 plants that were placed on these long voyage canoes. And these 27 plants were what they needed for food and for spiritual needs and shelter as well, but most significantly food. And so these plants became really tied to Polynesian identity. And again, to this day, these are the staple food crops that we find all over Polynesia. Next slide, please. I'm going to jump a bit further over to China, where I've been working in the southern part of Yunnan. I'm actually not going to talk about tea today, although it's a fascinating plant and all sorts of great stories to tell about that too. But I'm talking about some research that was done in terms of identity and personality with food. China's pretty interesting. It's almost equally divided through the center of the country between areas that grow grains, primarily wheat, and in the south where rice is done. And the Yangtze River is more or less the dividing line for that. The study was done for over 1,000 personality tests given to Chinese students in the North and South. And this was based on a commonly held assumption that people in Northern China had, in the broad sense, in the aggregate, different personalities than you find in the South. And I should note that these types of studies are fraught with difficulties because, at the end of the day, it's easy to move into these stereotypes of people, and people don't always conform to that. But in the aggregate, there is some ways to get at how people respond to questions. And what this study found is that there was a difference in terms of more individualistic and analytical types of answers to the questions in the North, which is commonly seen as more stereotypical of the West, versus more interdependent and relationship oriented. Well, these personality differences correlated really strongly to where the crops it was grown. And so the hypothesis here is that these differences got set in place early on with the emergence of agriculture. Rice being a crop that requires cooperation versus grains that you can be done by farming in more of a solitary, or at least in a household manner. But rice harvests generally bring villages together. And so this created a shift in how people approach each other and how people approach the world, which is quite fascinating. Next slide, please. And this study's continued because this, one of the critiques of the earlier study that Tom and his research group had done is that, well, these weren't representative of people, and besides, that's one thing for farmers, but what about people that live in cities? And you might expect to see different approach in the city, especially in a city like Shanghai that's in the south part, at least in the rice growing area, but has had a lot of more integrated financial relationships with the Western world, and you could argue that moved more towards a capitalist model, economic model, earlier than other parts of China. And so you'd expect to see some of this more individualistic behavior present. And so I won't go too much into the study, but they tried to test through these behavioral interventions, in this case a Starbucks with over 8,000 people, and whether people would sort of accommodate their environment or work in a cooperative manner. And what they found were that even in Shanghai, and that people still reflected these differences in terms of white rice or wheat differences, where they came from. Next slide, please. I'm now going to jump all the way across to the other side of the world to Central America. And this is a satellite image. It may be a little confusing if you're used to a north-south orientation, because this is actually a east-west orientation. That's the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico on the right side of the screen, and Guatemala to the south. And then in the bottom of the screen, that's the beginning of the rest of Central America, Nicaragua, Honduras, etc. In any case, this is where the Garifuna, or in plural, Garinagu people live today. And then the Garinagu are a seafaring coastal people that have a really amazing ethnogenesis in terms of how their culture came into being. And they didn't start off in the Caribbean here. They actually started off in lowland South America, in the Amazon. Next slide, please. And what we see with the origins of Garifuna culture is that starting a very long time ago, it's unclear exactly when, but hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, you start to see this migration of primarily Arawak speaking people out of the Amazon. And they most likely hugged the coastline of what's now known as Brazil, and walked or paddled their way up around the coast to get to the Caribbean. This is the most likely route, simply because the Guianan Shield presents some pretty massive landforms that would be difficult to just go directly north. In any case, they ended up in the Caribbean with a sophisticated technology in terms of boats and maritime culture. and began to settle in some of these islands. And much of the Caribbean was populated by, hence the name, Carib-speaking populations. And so you saw this interesting mix between Arawak language and Carib language, and this is reflected in Griffin today, that has pretty distinct differences depending on whether a man is speaking it or a woman speaking it. And that harkens back to the direct relationship between the Arawak language and the Caribbean language. So that was the beginning of the Griffin, but then one other element had to come in, which were African populations. And so there's sort of a apocryphal story of a shipwreck on the island of St. Vincent's. And there was, in fact, a shipwreck, slave ship shipwrecked, and African peoples then inhabited the island. But it's likely that this happened many, many times throughout the Caribbean. And this intermarriage between West African populations and lowland South American and also Carib populations led to the Griffin culture being established. And to this day, the language is almost entirely derived from American Amerindian or from the Caribbean, South America. Phenotypically, as you can see in the pictures, people tend to look more like we would see people from West Africa or the Caribbean look like that have African ancestry. But the culture itself is this nice blend now. Now, what does food have to do with this? Well, it ends up that there's a really important staple crop, Manioc esculenta or Manioc cassava or yucca. It goes by a bunch of different names in English. And the Arawak migration led to Manioc traveling with them. And it moved up into the Caribbean, and it became widely adopted as a staple crop by the Griffina. And this is virtually the only place you see Manioc being consumed today in Central America is by the Griffina people. And you don't find it again until you go 1,000+ miles, a couple thousand kilometers down into the Amazon, where it also becomes a staple crop again. So they brought it with it, and it's centrally tied to their identity. But the story doesn't end there. There's a couple, next slide, please. Manioc is pretty fascinating in terms of stable crops because of the toxicity of it. Now, there's two major groupings between bitter manioc and sweet manioc. Sweet manioc has entered into commercial cultivation and commerce, and so if you buy it at a grocery, you're likely to get sweet manioc because the grocer doesn't want you to prepare it wrong and kill you. But in terms of traditional communities, the preferred form is this bitter manioc that has cyanogenic glycosides in it that can be deadly. And so people developed a really complex processing in order to get this sap and the juice out of there and to create a flour. And an important piece of technology they developed to do this is the reguma in order to process the liquids out of it. That makes this manioc culture become really valuable because this bitter manioc, once processed, has a really long shelf life. It's stable for possibly years, which you can imagine is pretty useful for a group of people that migrate a lot. And the Griffina migrated throughout the Caribbean onto coastal Belize and Guatemala, but they've also migrated out of Central America. And so today, there's, depending on who does the estimates, there's probably more Gurinagu living in North America than they are in their ancestral homeland. And next slide, please. And as they moved to North America, people started to switch these non-bitter varieties because it's hard to find the bitter varieties. I mentioned that you just don't find it at the grocery store. But they kept this processing tool with them. And especially for Gurinagu that moved to the city of Los Angeles in the USA and also Chicago, because of their phenotype, people would assume that they were African American and had a similar identity as other African Americans in the U.S. But in fact, they wanted to maintain their cultural identity. So an important object that Griffina have used is this reguma. And it's very common if you go to someone's house or apartment in the U.S. that this is going to be hanging on the wall. And they never use it, but it serves this important marker again, placing food front and center to who they are as a people and their cultural identity. Next slide, please. Well, identity, unpack it a little bit. It's a complex phenomena. We sort of create our own identity, and certainly by the foods we eat and we don't eat helps with that. But it's both an internal process for a particular group of people, but also an external process. So we are who we are based on what we do, but also what we don't do and what other people sort of determine who we are. And these are called ethnic markers. And food choices and food avoidances are really useful to look at this. I'm going to tell one last story of the Tzeltal Maya, specifically the rat eaters, as they're known, of Oshchuk in Chiapas, Mexico. Next slide, please. And just to locate you, again, this is another satellite image. In this case, north is aligned to the top of the screen. And so in this central highland area, next slide, you find two major languages, Tzotzil Maya and Tzeltal Maya, and an enormous amount of language differentiation in both dialectical shifts and these two languages. And there's a very clear language line running through that's so pronounced that literally there's communities on opposite sides of the street that speak a different language. And also in each of these municipalities, the dialect is so different than the other one that within less than a minute of speaking to somebody, you know exactly where they're from. Their dress is also distinct to these municipalities or municipios. So to take a language like English, where you'd have to travel from North America to the United Kingdom to Australia to see these dialectical shifts, we have this within 20 or 30 kilometers. This is really fascinating in terms of biocultural diversity and this relationship between cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, and the biodiversity. And again, food becomes pretty important here. And I'm going to just talk about the people of Oshchuk. Next slide. This is one of 6 Tzeltal municipios. And what's fascinating is, despite the dialectical difference in the language and despite the different clothing that they wear, everything else is virtually the same. I mean, they have the same origin myths, same stories, same foods, same medicinal plants, same type of farming practices, except for one thing. And the Oshchuk are unique amongst all these municipalities because at somewhere along the way they decided to eat these rats. These are enormous rats, and you can see them here in the slide. They splay them and dry them out and hang them up in the market and sell it sort of as a rat jerky. And they're quite proud of this. There's no shame at all. And in fact, the rat can be quite delicious. But the other municipalities around them think that there's something quite strange about them for doing this, and that it was a way for them to so clearly differentiate their own identity simply through this one food source. Next slide. And just in conclusion, in this short amount of time, I'm going to just say that it's pretty clear food's playing a central role in myths throughout history, and we see it in these origin myths, and I've been collecting a lot of these. I hope to put them together in a longer form one day soon. But we also see that cultural identity itself is intricately linked with food, and the phrase "you are what you eat" is in fact quite true. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick, for this very, very interesting insight into the connection of our identity and what we eat. So on point. I mean, it's 29 minutes. Fantastic. I think this has opened up the spectrum of how we talk about food in a completely, not completely new perspective, but putting it so much, or centering it at us at the humans, and not so much the technological parts of it that we've also been discussing. I think it's so important that we keep saying we are what we eat, but what does it really mean to be what we eat? And the close connection between linguistic biodiversity and plant biodiversity. That's just something that's awes me, you know, where I think, wow, never thought of that as ever before, but that's just pretty cool how food has shaped us all along, I guess.
Yes.
We, you know, we have been shaped by food, definitely. Since it's 5:30 here, we sort of wrap it up in this round here, and we move the discussion into the Jitsi room, where all of you as an audience are invited to join Rick and me in a further discussion, ask more questions, you know, comments, share your thoughts. You know, maybe there were some things that need to be repeated. You know, we look at again in more detail for this final discussion today. So you'll find the Jitsi link to the deep dive session in the YouTube description or in the Convention Hub on our homepage. And for you, Rick, we will post it to you in a second. Just on an organizational matter, again, this is sort of our final keynote of this track today. This was a wonderful grand finale to all the different aspects that we've talked about, where food and culture are so closely related, bringing it down to our identity at its core today. And thank you for doing this so perfectly, Rick. And I hope you as an audience will all be there again tomorrow, when we will have wonderful speakers as well, going about talking with, having Carolyn Steele there as an opening keynote, looking at cities and how we can have food production, how food production and cities are closely connected, looking at true cost accounting, looking at global south, global north perspectives. So lots of different and interesting topics again tomorrow. I hope we will see you all there again. And I'll see you in a minute in the Jitsi room in the deep dive session. Thank you so much, Rick, for these insights, and I'll see you in a bit.
Yes, thank you.